Well, hello everyone, and thank you for coming out today for this event. It's wonderful to see you and see so many people show up for an important discussion. Last week, Dr. Condoleezza Rice delivered the Distinguished Carlson Lecture here at the University of Minnesota as part of a series of events that have taken place under the title of Keeping the Faith with the Legacy of Justice that are sponsored by the Hubert Humphrey School of Public Affairs in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Over the preceding month, as people at the university and beyond became aware of the invitation and the event, both became subjects of a growing controversy. News media reported on it and weighed in. Faculty members and student organizations made public statements. A contentious vote was held in the Faculty Senate. The university president issued a public statement, and the event itself was accompanied by significant protests. Now, a lot has been said over the last month or so about this, and today's event is not really taking place in order to rehash all of those arguments for and against. Instead, we've come together today to reflect on some of the larger issues that the debate has raised, and to try to consider these issues from a variety of perspectives. And toward this end, I'm actually going to try and keep my opening comments brief to save time for discussion, but I want to provide a little framing for the discussion to follow. A number of issues, I think, have been raised for us as a university community. One set of issues centers on the question of speech on campus. From the beginning, let's say that not everyone can speak on campus. We have to pick and choose. We have to invite. We have limited resources, and we know campus is not equally accessible to everyone, so we confront some questions from the very beginning. What should our priorities be in allocating our time and resources and spaces? And in thinking about that, we also have to raise the question, and a question raised very much in the recent events: what is free speech, and how does it relate to academic freedom of inquiry? Is free speech violated in any way under any circumstances where a university decides to, say, withhold or rescind an invitation to speak on its campus? Is it possible, as well, to object to the terms of a speaking event on campus without violating freedom of speech? After all, when you object to the terms of a speech, you are setting conditions on that speech in some sense. So how do we distinguish the two? And if it's possible to do that, what sorts of terms are legitimate grounds for such objections? In addition, we might say that these events have pushed us to ask, what distinctions, if any, should we draw between objecting to the airing of viewpoints on the one hand and objecting to the actions of an invited speaker who is airing those viewpoints on the other hand? And then finally here, I'll start us off by asking the question, when we as a university invite public officials to speak here, under our values of freedom of inquiry and in relation to the idea of freedom of speech, what are our obligations when we invite speakers in terms of speaking out as part of the event in ways that hold them accountable for their actions and, in fact, their viewpoints? A second set of issues I want to suggest are raised by the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a frame for the event. As National Security Advisor and then as Secretary of State under the Bush administration, Dr. Rice had played a leadership role in actions that have been widely criticized as violations of civil rights and of human rights. Some who believed that Dr. Rice should be welcome to speak on campus objected to her speaking in honor of a movement that fought against these very sorts of civil and human rights violations, and objected to her speaking under the banner of keeping the faith with the legacy of justice as a result. This raises the question, what are our obligations when we here at the university frame the present in relation to the past? And in this context, how should we think about the relationship between civil rights struggles inside the United States and civil and human rights issues beyond this country's borders? Finally, in this context, I think we also have to think some about the conditions of this particular event in terms of the fee that was paid, $150,000 for a brief speech. After all, the civil rights movement was deeply engaged in the struggle for economic justice, and many of the core economic justice issues of our time center on the question of rewards for those at the top of the distribution. At the same time, I think in terms of the civil rights movement and the framing of this event, it should be noted that to some it seemed hard to imagine a more appropriate speaker than Dr. Rice, given her biography as an African-American woman raised as a child in Birmingham, Alabama, a woman who rose through the ranks of a field that is notoriously hostile both to women and to people of color. In many ways, she seemed to be the embodiment of the legacy of the civil rights movement and to offer a unique perspective on it. Others argued, from a contrary perspective, that Dr. Rice was not an expert on civil rights or even someone who worked in the field, and that this was relevant if we were to consider her personal qualifications or biography. Questions then raises, how should we think about the relationship between personal biography and acts of speaking on behalf here on campus? In what ways should we consider formal credentials and expertise in deciding who speaks on what issues? And how should we grapple with these issues today against the long and shameful history of tokenism and approaches to diversity that are really more symbolic than substantive? And finally, I think we should reflect a bit on the money itself. The fee of $150,000 paid by the Carlson family. Beyond this event and going forward, how should we think about speaking fees at the University of Minnesota? This, of course, is a market of choice. We may not like the way markets work when it comes to academic administrators or faculty members. We can just decide how to respond to those markets, but we can't opt out of them. All right? That's part of our basic functioning. Speakers' fees are a market of choice. And so we have to decide whether or not to participate in it, and if so, how. And we have to reflect on that issue, I think, against the backdrop of a winner-take-all economy and the issues of economic justice in our times. I think we have to think of it more locally as well here at the university in an era of public austerity. How should we think about this in the context of a time of mounting and tremendous student debt, low adjunct pay, calls for belt tightening across the university as a whole? In what ways should our public university understand itself to have an obligation to limit the ways it participates in either paying itself or endorsing and participating in the payment of fees this large? We should also think about in this regard that this is how we make many extraordinary opportunities available to our students and to the rest of the community. Many of the students I've talked to over the last few days have emphasized, who were at the event, have emphasized what an incredible experience it was for them. Some of them have also talked about their experiences in the protest, and in fact, some people have been the same people who protested and also attended some events. Something to think about. And then finally, I'll just sort of frame this in a broader sense. We're living through a period of tremendous concentrations of private wealth and a period of great public fiscal austerity. And the result of that is that in a variety of contexts, we here in the university confront decisions on a routine basis about how much to let our need, our desperate need in some cases, for resources that are held by particular actors, to how much should we let that set our agendas? To what extent do we decide which events to hold and what the terms of those events will be? By thinking about what will draw resources from those who hold them. And what does that imply for a public university? Okay, the controversy surrounding Dr. Rice's visit, I think, provides a unique opportunity for the university community to reflect on these issues and a host of additional issues. So I'd like to thank the organizers for today's event. University of Minnesota Sociological Association, University Political Science Association, Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature Student Association, and Students for a Democratic Society. I'd also like to thank a variety of faculty members who I will not name, who have participated in this from the beginning and who have played an instrumental role in making this happen. But I do want to mention by name Terry Caraway, who's done a tremendous amount of work on behalf of this event, and we're all grateful for that. And finally, I want to thank our sponsors, the Department of Political Science, the Don A. Martindale Endowed Chair in Sociology, and the Stassen Chair of International Affairs in the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and Department of Political Science. We're lucky today to have 5 panelists here with us. I'd like to introduce them, and then I'm going to ask them each to speak for about 5 minutes. After that, I'll pose some questions for the panel as a whole to discuss for a while, and then we will move on to some audience discussion, and we'll have some microphones for people to engage in that. We have here today with us Prahith Chaka, to my left here, who's the current chair of the University of Minnesota Student Senate, elected by senators from all 5 campuses of the University of Minnesota system. He's active in the Minnesota Student Association and serves on multiple committees and boards throughout campus. He was outspoken in opposing a University Senate resolution objecting to Condoleezza Rice's visit, and more generally has opposed efforts to rescind or denounce her invitation. Down the way, we have a second student panelist, Amanda Zimmerman, who is a Spanish Studies major and who is active in Students for a Democratic Society. It's also worth noting she teaches piano and plays in 2 bands. We also have with us, in between here, Major Todd Pierce, who served as an Army Defense Counsel in the Guantanamo Military Commissions from 2008 to 2012, representing 3 different prisoners. Though now retired as an Army JAG officer, he remains on an appellate case currently before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. An issue in that case is the right to know of the American people under the U.S. Constitution. He argues that this right to know, free speech, is most important during times of conflict to ensure achieving goals that best represent national interests and security. At the end of the table is August Nimps from the Political Science Department. August was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, where he experienced, resisted, and fought against the system of racial segregation known as Jim Crow. Because of the successes of that fight, he was able to be hired by the University of Minnesota to teach in the Department of Political Science and later became an adjunct in the Department of African American and African Studies. In his comments today, Professor Nimps will draw on some relevant ideas from his most recent book, Lenin's Electoral Strategy, The Ballot, the Streets, or Both. And finally, we have in the middle of the table here, Naomi Sheeman, who has taught at the university since 1979 in the departments of philosophy and what is now gender, women, and sexuality studies. Throughout her career, she has been deeply involved with issues of equity and diversity. She graduated from Barnard College, part of Columbia University, in 1968, and was a member of Students for a Democratic Society. She's the president of the University of Minnesota chapter of the Association of American University Professors, AAUP, which is the organization historically at the center of the defense of academic freedom. But today she's speaking as an individual, not as a representative of the AAUP or any unit of the university. Okay, I'd like to start with the first of our panelists. I'd actually like to start with our 2 student panelists. So I'm going to begin down the way here with Amanda Zimmerman. So 5 minutes.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role that the student movement has played in the anti-war movement, both historically and today. Students for a Democratic Society organized the protest in opposition to Condoleezza Rice's speech here on our campus last week. About a month earlier, we submitted a resolution to the Faculty Senate that initiated a very lively public debate. Through these actions, we prevented her from completely erasing her history and evading the responsibility that she had in the role of the Iraq War and the post-9/11 policies. For example, extraordinary rendition, unilateral preemptive war, and torture in places like Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, and other so-called black sites. Our anti-war and anti-torture demonstrations are successful strides toward rebuilding a strong progressive student movement at the U of M. A quick look at student movement history can offer some lessons about how last week's protests served this function in spite of vocal opposition by university leaders, like President Kaler and some of U of M's student government. In the early 1960s, SDS as a national organization had less than 1,000 members, and there was not yet a national movement against the Vietnam War. The Cold War then, just as the War on Terror now, restricted political debate and resulted in a pro-war consensus, which silenced anti-war voices with anti-communist witch hunts and eroded civil liberties in the name of national security. We don't have to look far to see these examples of this happening today. In 2010, the FBI raided the homes of anti-war committee and SDS members here in Minneapolis, not on the grounds of any criminal activity, but for organizing peaceful protests of the Republican National Convention in 2008. We oppose this modern-day McCarthyism and recognize that those in power use all sorts of seemingly legitimate covers to silence dissenting voices, from rhetoric about threats to national security to oddly distorted concepts of free speech or American freedom. We refuse to let these accusations silence our own dissenting voices. The campus environment we inhabit today is similar in many ways to that of the early 1960s. In 1962, SDS wrote of the bleak state of student activism and of the individualized and passive culture of American college students. SDS saw their task then, as we do now, to work with the student body as students in order to effect progressive change and build a student movement. On April 17, 1965, exactly 49 years ago to the day from our protest last week, SDS organized the first ever national march against the Vietnam War. This marked the beginning of student engagement on many pressing political issues of the day. It propelled SDS into the national spotlight. SDS's ranks grew from 1,000 members in the early 60s to 100,000 by the end of 1968. In May of 1970, over 4 million students and 350,000 faculty went on strike in opposition to the Vietnam War, demonstrating on more than 400 campuses. The political culture changed rapidly from the anti-communist and militaristic Cold War consensus of the early 60s to the radical campus rebellions of the late 60s. The student movement today recognizes that our generation faces its own pressing political issues: global wealth inequality, environmental injustice, high tuition costs, endless wars, civil rights, workers' rights, immigrant rights, racism, deportations, mass incarceration, police brutality, capitalism, and an unfair and increasingly corporate school system. We hope to one day address all these issues together as a united student movement. But today, our movement is splintered by the multitude of issues that it is trying to address. So we work within our capacity on the immediate and relevant problems as they present themselves. Many of us were not even 10 years old on September 11th, 2001. We grew up with the fact of war. Many students don't even know, for example, who Condoleezza Rice is, what she has done, and most importantly, what she stands for. Staking out opposition to illegal wars, torture policies, and war criminals becomes all the more pressing when these people are invited onto our campuses. We hope that SDS will contribute to a resurgent student movement to address all the political issues of our day. We hope that you can see that our opposition to Condoleezza Rice was not about silencing free speech, but instead a part of a growing effort to rebuild a democratic, just, and transparent campus, nation, and world. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Rahith?
All right. I'd just like to say thank you to the organizers of this event. I'm kind of glad that this event is even happening, and I think the only reason this event would be happening is if Condoleezza Rice, as she did, came and spoke. When we're talking about transparency, when we're talking about making leaders accountable, one of the biggest things in making them accountable is creating a dialogue. Creating the dialogue would be if she actually came and spoke, which she did. We saw with the protests. We saw, like the previous speaker said, most of my peers, 9, 10, 11 years old when 9/11 happened. Some of us do not know, and I'm hoping that number shrink, who Condoleezza Rice even was, or even is. And the fact that we had the dialogue, the fact that we did kind of create the commotion, the debate that happened, more and more students know who Condoleezza Rice, what her role exactly was in the administration. And when I spoke out against the resolution, it wasn't as an endorsement of Condoleezza Rice's policies. More so, it was an endorsement of her ability to speak on this topic, keeping faith with the legacy of justice. And many times, especially I would believe the members of this audience, when we hear keeping faith with the legacy of justice and we hear Condoleezza Rice's name in the same sentence, we kind of get confused. But that depends. We are putting our own frame of what we consider justice in her life to the perspective that we're trying to share with students. One of the main things in the resolution that I opposed, and the senators did get quite a few papers from various perspectives. This was not a decision made lightly. There was a good amount of debate in this body, was that we shouldn't, we should not pretend that past historical events never took place. And an institution of higher learning should educate its students and community about past historical events. Now, I don't think that these two things can be held together. We cannot just censure a future speaker because we disagreed about their past historical events, and then suddenly expect more students to know about the issue, more students to talk about the issue. It doesn't work that way. And while our students do respect the judgment, we do respect the education that we're getting from our various distinguished faculty and professors, we would like to keep that more specifically in the classroom. And I'll tell you a little bit about how this debate went on in the University Senate. The University Senate composes of civil service, professional administration staff, faculty, and lastly, students generally. Students very rarely speak up in the University Senate. This very last meeting, when we were discussing Condoleezza Rice, the bulk of the speakers were students. And I think that's, and they almost all were speaking pro letting her speak, not condemning her, anti the resolution. And I think when you have people like, normally I don't weigh in something if I think it's too political. This I don't think was a matter about politics. I think it's about an unfair level of scrutiny that we did place on her versus other speakers who, you know, depending on what you consider justice in regions like Timor, Armenia, or Rwanda. And I think the lack of intervention, and this is my own personal belief, the lack of intervention would be the equivalent of unfair practices that would happen in interventions when it comes to topics about justice. But sorry, back to what I was saying. The very fact that Mike Schmidt, president of MSA, the very fact that President Kaler even spoke about the resolution before he sat down, the very fact that I stood up and said something shows that this was something that was reflected by the bulk of the populace at the university. And 122 to 21 vote against this resolution shows that the majority of the university, at least through its representatives, agreed that in order to open up the dialogue, we should have her speak. Now, does having her speak suddenly mean we endorse any of the actions post 9/11, including entering the Iraq War or allegations of torture? No, of course not. The University of Minnesota's reputation will not be tarnished as much as we consider, you know, Stanford suddenly a harbor of war criminals. And if you consider Stanford University a harboring of war criminals, I would imagine you would be in the minority. If you consider the University of Illinois in Chicago to be a host for domestic terrorists, then of course you would be in a minority instead of viewing it as an institution that allows alternative perspectives on this issue. Again, one thing we have to keep in mind today when we're listening to these speakers is what our own definition of justice is. What Condoleezza Rice's definition of justice was, especially, you know, growing up, not the greatest opportunity as growing up African American in the South in the time that she did, but the fact that she was able to get to the point that she did shows that she at least got that justice in her life. And that's at least how I viewed her speech. It was not a rant on pro-torture or pro-war, as none of her other speeches were when she was talking to universities. So I'd just like you guys to keep that in mind.
Great, thank you. Major Pierce.
Just in the last day or two, the Deputy Prime Minister of Japan has created something of a controversy amongst the Asian countries for remarks he made that Japanese nationalists, ultra-nationalists, should change their constitution, the one they're unhappy with because it was adopted after World War II and it took away you know, the right to have a military in some ways and whatnot. So he said that Japanese nationalists should work to change the constitution, as he put it, without anyone noticing it, like the Nazis had done. And where I've worked since 2008 in the military commissions, I've seen firsthand how we have been changing our constitution, trying to do it without anyone noticing it. And within that faction that was working the hardest, and it really went into high gear back in 2001, as everybody here knows, I'm sure, under Dick Cheney, David Addington, John Yoo, where they began inventing extra constitutional theories of government that allowed absolutely unconstrained power by the president to do anything that the president believes they should do, without any oversight by Congress or by the American people. And they made this argument, well, we're at war, and therefore the president has these war powers, and Congress cannot constrain the president. The president can torture people even if he chooses to, in spite of any international treaties prohibiting it. Condoleezza Rice was elbow to elbow with Dick Cheney when they were briefing George Bush on those policies. And there's no doubt about that. Nobody disputes that. She was, in a troika, a group of 3 people. She was right at the center of things. But working, in the military commissions, I began having to do quite a bit of research into free speech, because that's one of the issues, as I say, in a case I'm on right now. But it's not the free speech right of the detainee that I'm concerned with, or that we're concerned with. We're concerned with the actual meaning of the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, which is the right to know of the American people, of those people who live in a democracy, because how can you even vote knowledgeably if you don't have the right to know? So it goes to the very core, the very essence of democracy, that we need to have a right to know, not just to speak, our opinions, or to watch a X-rated movie or whatever, but the fundamental premise of the entire Bill of Rights by the framers, and they repeated this numerous times, making it very clear, was to provide the American people, as part of a democracy or a republic, the means to provide oversight of their government officials so that they don't get doing things that are so much against their national interest. So in doing more and more research, and as a military officer, I was doing some professional education at the same time, and getting presented with the various papers that pretty clearly were out of the mainstream of what it would have been 20 years ago in military understanding of things. So again, one thing led to another, and I began realizing, and we put this into various briefs, that going back to the Vietnam War, and those of you, who are old enough to remember it, and those of you who aren't old enough should go back and read it and study about it, because it is a perfect example of where we had a need for the right to know and free speech. I've said recently to a number of people that if you want to consider who is a greater military strategist, William Westmoreland and a couple of the officers around him, Lieutenant General Davidson, all of whom wrote books after the Vietnam War on how they could have won the war, or whether it would have been Pete Seeger, who wrote a song about getting out of the, not going any further into the deep muddy, I believe it was. And in the way that Clausewitz, who's conceded to be the greatest military strategist generally, wrote on war, it would have to be Pete Seeger. Because Clausewitz said, any reasonably wise ruler knows you don't keep going deeper and deeper into war that you cannot win. And there were military officers at the time who knew that we could not win in Vietnam, putting aside the merits of the war itself, but just thinking in strategic terms. Could we have won or not? And there are a few military officers who said, no, we can't, it's unwinnable. But instead, we listened to Westmoreland instead of Pete Seeger, and we kept going deeper and deeper in. And we would have done the same thing the Soviets did in Afghanistan, I suspect, had it not been for the right to know and free speech. But coming out of, in the protests that resulted from that, where we ended the war. But coming out of that war, Westmoreland and a few of his other generals, high-ranking generals, they ranted that, well, they would have won, but for free speech, and the next time we have a war, we have to have military detention for dissenters, we have to have censorship, and on and on. Well, we do have the Constitution that gives some protection against that, so they had to come up with more ingenious means to get around that. And we've been seeing that over the last 20 years as information management has been developed. And that's what my objection would be to Condoleezza Rice's event here. It wasn't about her free speech. It was a denial of our right to know, our right to have a dialogue with her, and instead it was her merely manufacturing public opinion, which, I'll just close with this. James Madison wrote, "Public opinion sets bounds to every government and is a real sovereign in every free one. Public opinion is clear," and then it goes on to say, "Public opinion is clearly linked to public knowledge." Well, if you look at Condoleezza Rice's appearance here, whether it's for rehabilitating her for future political ambitions or just to rehabilitate the Bush administration and what they tried doing, it was all about manufacturing public opinion by coming in with a one-sided dialogue, if you will, so that nobody could challenge her with questions, and that is not what free speech is about, nor is it giving us the right to know as a university should provide.
Professor Sheeman?
It's wonderful to be here and to see this event happening, and thanks to the people who worked so hard to make it happen, especially to Terry Caraway. As Joe mentioned in his introduction, I was a member of SDS, class of 1968, and I'm thrilled to see it reemerging here and elsewhere in the country. We get painted, and again, this is sort of a manufacturing history, that we were destroying universities, we were anti-intellectual, we were up to all kinds of bad stuff, and I'm sure the same criticisms are being made today. But I think actually what we were doing and what the people who are involved in SDS now, I think, are doing is really defending what's best about universities, defending the values that we ought to be standing for against various encroachments that against the right to know that can come from the government, but also encroachments that come from what was then called and still exists, the military-industrial complex, the increasing corporatization of universities, the mounting debt that students are graduating with, which is something quite different from when I was in college. And that this idea of what is it that a university ought to be, and what are the values that we ought to be standing for, and what is it that has been accomplished and remains to be accomplished by radical student movements? I mean, one of the principal things that was accomplished at this university and is a lasting legacy of radical student and community activism back then was the African and African American Studies Department, which would not have happened had it not been for radical activists who were trying to make this university live up to the best of its possible ideals. So what I want to do now is read to you something that I wrote and that the Star Tribune and the Daily did not publish. It couldn't have been in both places, but neither of them wanted it. So you're going to get it. The University of Minnesota Senate on the 3rd of April overwhelmingly rejected a resolution condemning the invitation from the Humphrey School to Condoleezza Rice to deliver the Carlson Distinguished Lecture on the 17th of April. As one of the senators who helped to craft the resolution, and I have to say that when I was first approached by SDS about bringing something to the Senate, I wasn't sure that that would, I can't even remember what I was thinking. It was late at night, I was tired, and so I did not get back in a helpful way. The person who did get back in a helpful way and who really carried the water of bringing the resolution to the Senate and bore the abuse that rained down on his head and his voicemail and his email because he did it is Professor Bill Messing from the math department. But I did help to amend it, and I spoke to it on the floor. And the resolution originated with the university's chapter of Students for Democratic Society. So as one of those people, I was, of course, disappointed by the vote and by the discussion that preceded it, and I've been dismayed at the subsequent coverage. That coverage, articles in the Star Tribune and the Minnesota Daily and comments on them, as well as letters to the editor and a public statement from President Kaler, have portrayed the vote as an unmitigated triumph for the freedom of speech against narrow-minded attempts at suppressing controversial ideas. This take on what happened reflects a deep, pervasive, and troubling misunderstanding of free speech and academic freedom, why they matter, and what they have to do with universities in particular. The problem with the coverage is that it ignores and distorts the actual intent of the motion and the arguments of those who proposed and spoke in support of it. The clear message is that if you are powerful and your words are already available at the click of a Google search, you can expect to be honored as a distinguished lecturer without being held to account for your actions or critically challenged about them. But if you attempt to speak out against the propriety of a university's sponsoring such an uncritically celebratory event, you can expect that, although of course you are free to speak, your words will be ignored or distorted. Not exactly an unmitigated triumph for the free exchange of ideas, but let's try again. Those who spoke against the motion, including President Kaler and a number of student representatives, including the one who spoke so eloquently just earlier today, repeatedly invoked freedom of speech and the importance of hearing diverse perspectives. But Rice's voice is hardly in need of the platform we're providing, and her thoughts about her African-American girlhood and struggles against racism are readily available. Surely no one expects her to say anything new. Those experiences and struggles are important and laudable, but her story is shared by many others who do not also happen to be credibly charged with war crimes. And that's the problem. We're supposed to think of her actions as Secretary of State that way, as something that just happens to be true of her, not something that needs to be addressed, not something she needs to answer for, but something that's irrelevant to the question of whether she deserves to be honored as a distinguished lecturer on the theme of justice, paid $150,000 with no expectation that she will do what, as an academic, she knows full well is the norm for university discourse, namely, engage in critical conversation, try to get at the facts, face uncomfortable truths. She'll be expected to do none of that. She hasn't been invited to advance the aims of a university or of free speech more generally. That's the core of the problem. We're not acting like a university. We're buying into celebrity culture and dishonoring our core mission and values. Free speech does not mean a free pass to escape critical engagement. It does not mean honoring someone while ignoring the credible voices that argue she is not worthy of being honored. Those voices can, of course, speak, and some of us did and will continue to do so. What we tried to say, and this is what was not heard, was that Rice's record is one we need to engage with, not officially pass over in discreet silence, that the university is a place for education and critical conversation, not for pushing difficult facts to the margins of our collective consciousness. The ball is now in the university's court. What do we, importantly including those who support Rice's lecture, plan to do to help make free speech, the vigorous pursuit of the truth, and serious critical engagement a reality? And that's the end of the unpublished op-ed piece, but that's exactly what we're doing here today. And I think this is the event that exemplifies a university's commitment to free speech and academic freedom. Thank you.
And lastly, Professor August Nips.
Thanks, Joe. I, too, want to thank the organizers, my colleague Terry Caraway, and especially the student organizations who were involved in putting together the program. I want to focus on the official rationale in the invitation and the program to which Rice was invited. The invitation, in my opinion, was symptomatic of a larger problem: how the Hubert Humphrey Institute has commemorated one of the two legislative conquests of the civil rights movement, the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And I admit I too was derelict in not having paid close attention to the program, how it was organized in order to be able to challenge it. I contend that the program, consciously or unconsciously, I don't know, attempts to reinvent history. If the Hubert Humphrey Institute programmers are to be believed, Hubert Humphrey, in alliance with Lyndon Johnson and peripherally John Kennedy, were the decisive actors in that victory. It's an elitist story in the most literal sense of how the victory was achieved. And thus, in good faith, could the organizers invite Condoleezza Rice, a fellow elite, to be the voice for those who were at the center of the actual course of events. The program the Hubert Humphrey Institute has put together, it began last August and it ends this June, is also reminiscent of what Marx, Engels, Lenin called parliamentary cretinism. I leave aside the political correctness of the term. And what I've supplemented with voting fetishism, the mistaken belief that what takes place in parliaments, like Congress, is the alpha and the omega of real politics, and that the registration of a preference for a candidate or a policy in an election is the same as exercising power. What was decisive in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is what occurred outside Congress, in the streets, beginning in Birmingham and spreading elsewhere. How else to explain why the good old boys in the worlds of the White House, Congress, and the Supreme Court finally saw the light? This was far from the diversity that we've come to know in all three branches. Hubert Humphrey was in previous Congresses, and there were civil rights acts that came before previous Congresses that were oftentimes civil rights acts that were basically defeated. I know this. I grew up in a household where my parents, every couple of years, would listen closely to see what would happen to the civil rights acts, and it never got out of the Congress in any kind of meaningful way. As far as I can tell from the official program for the commemoration, the only participant who actually participated in a grassroots way was Dr. Josie Johnson, who was long affiliated with the Hubert Humphrey Institute, who helped to organize the Minnesota contingent that participated in the historic March on Washington in August 1963, one of the key elements in understanding the passage of the Civil Rights Act. If you haven't had a chance to look at it recently, re-look at the Eyes on the Prize series. I showed it last night to one of my classes on what happened in Birmingham in the spring of 1963, 50 years ago. It was the masses in the streets and the violence that came with it, or the threat of violence, that convinced the recalcitrant Kennedy administration to submit to Congress the legislation that became the 1964 Civil Rights Act. JFK's June 11, 1963 speech is also clear. As he said, because the fires are burning throughout the country, I will introduce legislation in Congress. To not recognize where the real impetus began for the changes that all of us are beneficiaries of is not just a problem of reinventing history. It's a problem of miseducation and how to advance the still very much work in progress of the democratic quest. To depend on someone like Condoleezza Rice to help us understand those transcendental months in Birmingham is far from satisfactory. Through no fault of her own, I think, she, owing to her own class background, was part of that very, very small minority of black youth who failed to take part in the Children's Crusade, which was the turning point in the mass movement in Birmingham. The best she has to offer, in my opinion, and I'm not sure she presented it here when she spoke, is what she says it was like after Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's one thing for a piece of legislation to be passed. It's another for it to actually be enforced. Her description of how her family tested the waters is instructive. Unless millions of other black families did the same, the legislation would have been a dead letter. I can't tell you what it was like testing the waters of the legislation. That took courage. It's one thing, again, for Congress to have passed the act, another thing for it to actually be enforced. And it was all of us who decided to try to test the waters to figure out whether or not could we actually enter public spaces to see whether or not the legislation was meaningful or not, or effective. And unless millions of other blacks did the same, the legislation would have been for naught. I remember along these lines, I was in 7th grade when the Supreme Court declared that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional, the 1954 Supreme Court decision. And my teacher, Mrs. Barnes, came in running and telling us about it. And we all thought the next year we would be in integrated schools. 6 years later, I graduated from high school in New Orleans in a racially segregated school, despite the fact that the Supreme Court in 1955 ruled that racial desegregation had to proceed in all deliberate speed. My critique of the Humphrey program isn't confined just to the Hubert Humphrey Institute. It's a problem in political science generally. and the American subfield in particular. Again, what I call parliamentary cretinism and voting fetishism. Obama's speech, by the way, at the 50th anniversary commemoration last year is also indicative of this problem. It was all right, he said, to be in the streets in 1963. Marching was good then, but we don't have to do that now. I profoundly disagree, and why I'll gladly protest and march with anyone who wants to organize a similar action if he too makes an appearance here at the University of Minnesota. What happened the other day in Yemen, the more than 50 people who were killed, the suspects who were killed in Yemen because of drone attacks, is exactly why I'll be in the street protesting if he decides to make an appearance. As we all know, the chattering classes have finally discovered social inequality. I contend that the solution, a real solution to social inequality, will not be found in Congress, will not be found in the White House, will not be found in the Supreme Court. It will be found in the streets, where it can only be solved and where it will be solved. Thank you.
I want to thank all of our panelists for a great set of comments to get us started. I want to be aware of time and the fact that we have the auditorium until 6 o'clock. And so I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for audience participation and discussion, which I think is really important. So I'm going to limit actually the part of this where I pose questions to the panel, but I'd like to pose one question for discussion by the panelists. Anyone should feel free to take it up or not as they choose. But before we move on to the audience portion here, I'd like to ask people to reflect a little bit on how we should think about this event from the perspective of what is the role of the university in the broader polity, in the broader society, in the broader global order. In other words, what are our obligations in relation to politics more broadly? I've heard some language suggesting that, well, we should essentially see ourselves as a neutral site where various debates of the day might take place. I've heard calls for the university to express a certain set of values. I've heard the idea that in many ways the university ought to speak truth to power. I'm curious, what do you see as the role for principles and principled action with the university, and how should the university position itself when there are, and how should we as actors within the university approach these sorts of events when Condoleezza Rice or someone like that comes to campus? Thanks.
I'd be happy to speak to that. It gets at the difference between academic freedom and free speech. Academic freedom is different and more than free speech. It's a very special kind of protection that helps to define what a university is. And it has its firmest protection in tenure, which a lot of people resent. I mean, why should those of us who are lucky enough to have that kind of job security have it? And the only real justification for it is as a protection of academic freedom. That is, not risking our jobs by saying difficult, controversial things, by speaking truth to power. And those of us who have tenure and have that protection are supposed to use it to do two things, both to speak out, to say things that other people have to take more serious risks to say, and the other thing is to share it, to say that we will not only protect ourselves, but we will protect our colleagues who don't have tenure, we will protect students, we will protect others who come under this umbrella of having the university be a place where unpopular, difficult, critical things can be said. And if we don't do that, if we take the benefits of tenure and don't speak out and say difficult, critical, unpopular things, we're squandering something that has that other people have paid for, and we have no right to squander it.
Thank you. Others?
Yeah, I endorse all what Naomi just said. I would only simply add, I think at a public institution, a public university, we have a special obligation to the citizens of the state of Minnesota. And lastly, that academic freedom is something we should understand did not always exist. It had to be fought for. It had to be fought for, and it will have to be fought for to be maintained. In other words, we shouldn't subscribe to what I sometimes call university cretinism, thinking that it's what takes place in a broader society, what's going on in a broader society will determine whether or not we will be able to maintain academic freedom.
Would you like to respond? Others?
I don't have much to add to that, except you know, my idealized version of a university is where young people, you know, are able to expand their thinking, to go forth into society, you know, bringing that benefit to them. And I'm a firm believer in the benefit of dissent, you know, and that unity of thought is not beneficial for any society. I think we see that repeatedly. And when you do try to channel that into, you know, by using official means to limit the range of discussion, you betray that tradition and value that the university is supposed to have to society. And we've seen that in other places where the immediate target of authoritarian regimes is to shut down discussion and discourse on universities, and I don't need to list those many examples we've had from the 20th century.
Other comments? Well, since there weren't many comments, I'm going to ask a second question, and then we'll move to the audience. No one really picked up very much in their comments on an issue that's received a great deal of attention in the back and forth over the recent visit, and that I flagged at the beginning in my comments, which is the fee that was requested and delivered, $150,000 to Dr. Rice. And I'd like to ask the panelists to just reflect a little bit on what are your thoughts on how we should think about our obligations as a public university in a time of fiscal austerity and budget tightening and all the other things that I mentioned earlier. How should we think about the fact that we confront markets for speakers which charge certain prices, and if we want those people to come to the university, presumably one would need to pay those prices? And how should we think about these questions and position ourselves? Yeah.
I can go on that. When the Carlson family did donate this money to the Humphrey School for this purpose, they meant it for the purpose of these speakers. And people in their position, definitely when they're donating this large sum of money, they know exactly how much these speakers are going to cost. Political speakers, especially retired Secretary of States in particular, they charge a lot of money. Actually, I believe Hillary Clinton goes around $200,000, but I'm not going to debate that. One of the things that we should be doing as a university is trusting our own departments in our university. The resolution was changed to condemning the Humphrey School for putting out this invitation. But if the Humphrey School, and I trust the Humphrey School, I'm at this university, I trust this university, I respect this university, I respect their decisions, I respect their ability to make these decisions. This decision probably was not made lightly internally, and I do trust the Carlson family for their ability to intervene if they thought that this was not an effective use of money. So I would like to stress that this did not cost students money. There were students from the most conservative to the most liberal. They were all requesting free tickets. MSA did a great job in getting a lot of free tickets for students. The money wasn't going to go to lowering tuition or anything else. It was meant for public speaking, and $150,000 for a position like this is a normal speaking fee that Humphrey and Carlson probably well considered.
Nothing against the Carlson family or Marilyn Carlson, but to be honest with you, I don't trust the Carlsons. Nor do I trust the Humphrey Institute or the University of Minnesota or the U.S. Army or any other institution we have in society. Fairly un-American and anti-constitutional to sit and say that we should defer to these elites of whatever sort they may be. And I'd be saying the same thing whether it was a Condoleezza Rice or some very rich benefactor trying to buy influence by bringing Hillary Clinton here. I'd welcome both, Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, but I'm sure they can get those monies elsewhere. And even, again, somebody who's been part of the financing of the university, such as the Carlsons, to them, maybe they have a greater duty to use that money that will really reach more people in the university versus just promoting their own narrow political interest. So that, I would say, I don't trust any of them. I would add, earlier somebody mentioned, well, she teaches at Stanford, and of course Stanford wouldn't have a war criminal. And I'm not impugning the Hoover Institute, for example, which is generally considered quite conservative or right-wing. But they recently came out with a report about a year ago, co-authored, I believe, by Ben Wittes, or with Ben Wittes, where they actually say, and I forget the exact language, but Wittes, or whoever it is that wrote, I think it was Wittes, indirectly undermined the First Amendment by saying, well, yeah, we do have a right to speech, but implying, but we don't have a right to have anybody hear it or to share it with anybody else. We're framing this debate in the United States right now as national security versus constitutional rights, and that's an indirect way to do exactly like Deputy Prime Minister Osso suggests, is to change the Constitution by, how did I say he put it, by doing it with people, without people knowing it. And that's what's been going on, and I don't think the university, a public university, has an obligation to open its doors wide open to the richest benefactor to bring in their person to help promote that unconstitutional change. And I think in the case of Condoleezza Rice, not to pick on her individually, but she very much was a part of the unconstitutional change that has been being promoted over the last 14 years or so.
I think to talk about the fee specifically, it was money that was earmarked for this. It was not available to be used for anything else, so it was to bring in a speaker. And as I understand it, the decision was made by the dean or the dean plus somebody of the Humphrey School. And so I think it would have been regarded as inappropriate for the Carlson Foundation, whatever they are, to say they would get to choose the speaker. So in general, universities are attentive to not having certain kinds of strings attached to donations. There have been, at other universities, examples of donors wanting to say who could hold a chair that they were going to donate money for, and universities, for the most part, tend to resist those things. So, but the more general question of should the university be accepting money specifically designated to pay such sorts of speakers' fees, or should the university push back and say, well, donating $100,000, or as it ended up being $150,000, is quite wonderful and we really appreciate it, but we want to take the money for something that more fits with what we ought to be doing, and bringing in big-name celebrities, war criminals or not, to speak without critical engagement is not really what we think is a good use of this amount of money. So could we sit down and think about what else might be done with this very generous donation?
And I'll just simply say, I think it's symptomatic of a larger problem, the tendency under the capitalist mode of production for the privatization of public spaces. Capital seeps into every nook and cranny of society, the buying and selling of everything, the commodification of society.
Okay, I think we'll turn to the audience, and I'd actually like to start down here because you want to speak to this specific issue?
Well, a quick point is
okay, hold on just a minute. We need to get a microphone because we're actually recording here, so.
A quick point is that Rutgers, I understand, paid $35,000, so I think he got soaked.
But I think she got an honorary degree.
Looking at the macro of the problem, people that are fed disinformation can't make an informed decision. And unfortunately, we have the best entertained, least informed people on the planet. Now, I'm a national security whistleblower for more than a decade on illegal government domestic surveillance and systemic and institutional financial crime. I've been interviewed by Pulitzer Prize winner Dana Priest from the Washington Post, New York Times Pulitzer winner Gretchen Morgensen, senior executive producer for 60 Minutes, Bob Anderson, by Bloomberg. And automatically, all of those interviews the editors spiked or killed the stories. So freedom of speech is great if you can afford it. But in closing, so we can get to other people's questions, the United States is no longer part of the International Criminal Court. So that people like Condoleezza Rice, like Dick Cheney, like Don Rumsfeld, like George W. Bush can't go to Canada without being arrested for being a war criminal. And we're paying her $150,000 to speak here?
Let's try and go back and forth somewhere over there. Okay, we'll stay here then. Oh, no, okay, there's
We're supposed to be a country with due process, and I see us all as just victims of a broken down electoral process in this country, or one that never really fully developed. I mean, we were dealt this decade horribilis, and it's now going into the middle of the second decade because of the simple spoiler factor in Florida, and that's mathematically unnecessary. So we've got to get ranked choice voting in our executive races. And it got killed this year over at the Capitol. There's not enough citizen activism about this, and it's such a simple, necessary change. And then and a fruit of these alternative voting systems is that you get proportional representation. And if we had that, we would think proportionally as a society. And these rich people now, we have this winner-take-all system. And so these CEOs just take most of the compensation, and they can just drop $150,000 like that, and the rest of us have to run around like ants to try to fight that ginormous influence. And that shows that we don't have proportional thinking in our society because of our defective electoral system. And then when Obama comes in, he says we're going to move forward, not backward. And there were victims of this two-party system. They look partisan if they criticize a predecessor or whatever. And the two-party system, it's a fight. It's keeping us in a militaristic mode. And the healing hand of multi-parties has got to come through. And so please get active in electoral change, everybody.
Thank you. I'll just remind people we'd also like to have some questions so that we can respond to them. I know a lot of people just have things to say, which is great. I actually think that's great.
I think
people up here have talked. But
first say something, and then I'll end with a question. So as August Nimt said, but perhaps not strongly enough in terms of how I feel, it is disgraceful that the Humphrey Institute, in organizing this year-long activity, did not avail itself of bringing Shakur back from Cuba and paying her $150 grand. Could have asked Angela Davis to speak, could have asked Kathleen Cleaver to speak. These are three women far more meritorious and deserving to be invited to speak on this issue than Rice was. I think part of the problem altogether, I don't know how many people in this room know this, some do, Hubert Humphrey was a red baiter. He made a career out of going after people. He wanted to set up concentration camps for those who were members of the Communist Party. And you can look on the Wikipedia page, and this is made very explicit. You could look at the April 19th, 1976 Village Voice article about his record. So to end with a question, why is it that the University of Minnesota chooses to honor this disgraced Humphrey?
okay, I'll take a couple more, and then we'll open it up to the panel. There. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I hope this is on. I have a question and I have a comment. The comment concerns what Naomi Sheeman said. I'm a professor in the math department, and I think the thing that concerns me on balance the most is that there was absolutely no opportunity to ask questions. And I was very, very disturbed by this. I don't think that is appropriate at a university, not where serious intellects and critical thinking is supposed to be something that we're doing. And I do have a question, because people wonder why things have happened a certain way. But I have not heard in all of this, and maybe somebody on the panel or in the room knows, who actually chooses the Humphrey speakers? If it's just the dean, Eric Schwartz, that would be interesting to know. But I'm wondering, who chose Condoleezza Rice? I mean, somebody chose her.
Hi, yeah, I had a question. I guess I just have a question, no comment for the whole panel. But
I'm sorry, that's unacceptable.
I mean, I love a good rant, but not today. So according to the sheet for the show, it says when Rice was working for the State Department, it says she directed from 2005 until 2009 denied visas to numerous foreign scholars, and the administration deemed to be ideological problematic. So I guess my question to the panel would be, would you be willing to invite her back to talk about free speech?
Great, thank you.
Yes, this is a comment. I'm sorry, it's not a question. I attended the speech, and it didn't become clear to me until I actually attended the speech that she was not invited in to give a speech. That wasn't the purpose of this. The purpose of this, there might have been multiple purposes. One of the purposes might have been to honor her. How many other exhibits of free speech on campus do we have the introduction given by the University of Minnesota president? Do the University of Minnesota president and the chair of the Board of Regents sit on the stage for the entire presentation? This was to honor Dr. Rice, not to have her give a speech. There was nothing memorable in the speech. There was nothing particularly new for, whatever your politics were, there was nothing particularly new or insightful. I talked to people who are on the, had very different politics from me, and they had the very same impression that they didn't learn anything new. Another possible reason that Dr. Rice might have been invited is that speakers like this, when they're combined in a list of such renowned celebrities, give status to the Humphrey School. They invite these celebrities so they will gain credibility among schools of public affairs across the country. I don't think this had anything to do with the speech, and since it had nothing to do with the speech, it had nothing to do with free speech.
Hi, both the student representatives touched on how little people know about Condoleezza Rice's actual record. She did touch on a couple of controversial subjects in her lecture without going into much substance. One of them was Hamdan v. Bush, or Hamdan v. Rumsfeld, and I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit. The irony, of course, is that the Bush administration was the defendant in this and was trying to deny, was the prosecutor in this, was trying to deny some of these basic rights to the defendant, Hamdan, rights like habeas corpus and so forth.
So I have a question directed towards the representative from MSA. First of all, I will say I'm objective. I'm a member of SDS. And it's important to note, first of all, that we actually would have introduced the same resolution had it been Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, a Democrat or Republican alike, because we see them all kind of riding in the same boat together. But my question actually would be, you suggested that MSA somehow is promoting a dialogue. And I'm curious actually how you promoted any kind of dialogue when repeated invitations from SDS and organizers of this protests were actually not ever contacted by MSA, were never engaged in any kind of meaningful way. And further, I would like to actually know, for those students who were opposed to Rice's visit, which MSA representative actually represented our voice, since you suggest that MSA represented the voices of the vast majority of students, 70 or 80% of which haven't voted in MSA elections. But I'm curious which member represents the dissenting voice. Thank you.
Yeah, this is not the first time that we've had a public figure come to campus and get paid a lot of money and not be required to engage in much critical dialogue. So one of the things that I would like to ask the panelists is, under what circumstances would you find an invitation to Dr. Rice to be acceptable? And then looking for, if at all, maybe some of you think there are no circumstances under which she should be invited to campus. And then looking forward, based on your answer, what can we do as a university so that in the future, public figures who come to campus speak under circumstances that we think fulfill the mission of a public university?
Great. I'm going to take let's take a couple more, two more, and then I think we'll come back to the panel.
So I have a comment and perhaps a question. My comment is twofold. First, the issue of $150,000 at a university where frontline staff have seen their jobs cut in the hundreds over the last number of years. These are staff that make $17.50 an hour on average when the university is then paying someone $150,000 an hour is pretty heinous to me. Regardless of the source of funds, I think it sends a message about priorities and whose work has value. And I think that that's something that the university really needs to consider in terms of how work is valued and how contributions to society are valued, especially on an economic basis. The other so I guess I'm asking a question of how the university can shift the priorities and shift the discussion about what is valuable and where money should be spent and what recommendations you have for that. The other issue I wanted to raise, though, is the one about free speech, and I really did not see this as an issue of free speech. I think that the Humphrey School is a school that is based on teaching students to use, to seek truth through scientific methods, to be able to create sound political policies and public policies. And as someone who, prior to coming to the university, spent 15 years doing human rights work in Central America, where I sat, and I've shared this with some, I sat in union offices, spent the night in union offices so that they would not be bombed by the Salvadoran government because there were US citizens there. I visited villages that were bombed out and saw craters that were caused by US bombs. I visited offices where people were assassinated and they were clearing the bodies away as I was arriving. And I spent these 15 years doing that work and telling people that the policies of the US government were not the policies of, that were supported by a large number of US citizens. And so for me, Condoleezza Rice, and her involvement in advocating and lying and creating foreign policy based on lies is not a question of free speech. It's a question of bad foreign policy that has devastating impacts throughout the world. It created a war. And as bad as the situation was in El Salvador, the situation in Iraq was just tenfold, hundredfold worse due to the lies that were advocated by the US government. And I don't think it's an issue, I don't think lies are an issue of free speech. I think that we should be speaking the truth and advocating the truth. So, thank you.
Okay, I've got one more person down here that's been waiting for a while, and then I want to, we'll see if we have more time for audience, but I want to give a little time back to the panelists to answer some of these questions.
I'm going to start with a comment and end with a question. I'm a graduate of this university, and I called to get a ticket as early as I learned about it, and was told they were all gone the first day, but if I arrived early, I could go to will call and get a ticket. So I did that. I came here, I saw the police tape on the front of the steps. I've never seen that before. Then I went into a side door and went to the will call desk, and I said, I was told that in case there are people that have tickets, because they all went the first day, that there might be some no-shows and I could get a ticket. And they said, no. So that's my comment. But then my question is, how full was the auditorium for anybody who got in?
1,200 present according to the daily seating capacity, 2,700.
Okay.
I rest my case.
Well, thank you. I want to open the questions up to the panelists to respond to whichever ones you want to pick up on and address.
I just want to say something first. I want to salute whistleblowers, including that most famous American who released information of the government attempting to abridge or abridging liberties of Americans. And that, as everyone should know, is Benjamin Franklin, back in 1773, who had, as postmaster, came across information that the British government was going to abridge the freedoms of Americans, and he released that in a pamphlet and was celebrated in the colonies then. And that tradition has been, not carried on enough, but down to the present day with the likes of Edward Snowden, who did the exact same thing and nothing more. But then the other thing, somebody talked about the name of the place here, Humphrey, and I can't answer the question about why is that. But certainly we've seen multiple administrations work to suppress civil liberties, and the Johnson administration began it, or not began it, but I mean, with the Vietnam War, that era began it, and they had COINTELPRO with J. Edgar Hoover suppressing civil liberties and doing everything that we know he was doing, both against anti-war activists, but also against civil rights activists. And so it's particularly ironic to me that the group that Condoleezza Rice falls into, meaning particularly Dick Cheney, and that direct link back to the Nixon administration and all those things that the Nixon administration and J. Edgar Hoover is doing, puts her in the exact same company, I would argue, as those people who were working with J. Edgar Hoover to suppress civil liberties during the civil rights movement. So, I find that particularly odious that she now comes forward and speaks on behalf of the civil rights movement. I guess that's all I wanted to say.
I guess getting at some of the questions, the interesting questions that were raised, we have this terrible confluence of political power and the power of money, I mean, as August was talking about it, and a kind of celebrity culture. And so what would I think about inviting Condoleezza Rice here to actually engage in serious discussion about what she did? I think it would be terrific, but of course she's not going to come. She doesn't have to come. And we don't have subpoena power. And so we rely on the people that we've elected, and I don't think that that reliance is serving us very well, people who do have subpoena power to ask the hard questions. And so my sense is that we should engage in serious, searching, difficult, critical conversation with anybody who's willing to engage in it. And that's certainly not what she was brought here to do and not what she would come here to do. She doesn't have to. She's a well-paid celebrity who gets to be a well-paid celebrity and not have to answer for what she did.
Yeah, I think in response to a couple of comments that people made, I want to say that I really don't think we should be really surprised at what the university has become, what the Humphrey Institute does. As long as we have an economic system that allows for private accumulation of wealth, people who have their wealth will use their wealth to serve their interests. And unless we have a strategy about how do we change that, what's our long-term strategy for taking power out of the hands of this elite, then they will perform as business as usual. This is business as usual for them. And what we have to think about is how do we get rid of this kind of a system? And I think the fight for freedom of speech is crucial. Having debates and so on, having discussions and so on. So the importance of defending freedom of speech is a part of that process. But I don't think we really should be surprised at what's going on. When the Roberts Court made its decision the other day with the McCutcheon case on campaign financing, I think that they were acting in the spirit of the framers of the Constitution. They were acting in the spirit of the framers of the Constitution. And we shouldn't be surprised when you have an economic, socioeconomic system that allows for gross inequalities in wealth. People who have, that's what they do. They will use their wealth to shape outcomes that serve their interests. We shouldn't be surprised at that.
And I agree. You know, I'm not holding up the framers of the Constitution as the highest order of American government. But they did leave us those things they did leave us with that gives us some opportunities and rights to question them, the oligarchs and whatever you want to call them. So I think we do have an oligarchical system being fully developed, just like we accuse Russia of. But it does give us a right that we should insist upon is the First Amendment rights and the Fourth Amendment, those things that provide us the opportunities to give at least as much oversight and keep pushing for more of our government and of those who have so much power because of their immense wealth within society that take away our own voice. So again, those things that are in the Constitution that give us those powers, we need to take advantage of them. And with that, I want to also commend SDS, the students that were really getting this going, because they're doing exactly what students should be doing. And I just regret that there aren't more of them. Since 2001, we've embarked upon a series of policies that are counter to our interests. And by our interests, I mean those things, as the military used to recognize grand strategy, meaning those things that are best overall for society, not just military tactics and defeating this next country that we put in our sights, but education, the well-being of our people, taking care of them. But instead, we are just transferring more and more wealth to the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower would have put it, as we've seen so recently. No unemployment benefit expansion, but more money going to the military. So again, SDS is doing exactly what we should be doing, students should be doing, and I only wish that they could get more people working with them, because we need to change these policies. They're destroying our country. They're destroying the American middle class, American lower classes, everyone, except for that elite 1%, as Mitt Romney would be so happy to claim to be part of.
If I could just add on the question of the Constitution, I think it's something we should really think about. Why does the word democracy never, ever appear in the U.S. Constitution? It doesn't appear. Even in the post-Civil War amendments, it doesn't appear. It doesn't appear in the 1971, was the 25th Amendment. They gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. The word democracy never appears. We should never forget the framers were slave owners.
I'm not forgetting.
They were slave, and the reason why the Bill of Rights got attached is because the masses threatened.
Right.
It was true to what the masses were doing and the threats of the masses in the streets. They came out of Philadelphia without a Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
No, it's our side when we take to the streets or threaten to take to the streets. That's when we make changes.
Right.
Couple of comments and questions that were brought up. I'll try to tackle them one at a time. When we're talking about whether this is suppressing free speech by rescinding her invitation, I don't think it's a matter of free speech. I think it's a matter of open dialogue in the fact that we can have this, what do we call this, a colloquium? We can have this discussion, we can have this debate on issues that are far-reaching and above the breadth of what we would be asking Dr. Rice. I think the very fact that, yes, we don't necessarily agree that this one speaker should be given $150,000, and I can tell you, in all the budget meetings I've been to, everybody wants money for different locations. No one is ever actually happy with the budget, and I ask you all to come to the next full University Senate meeting where we do, the budget is at least presented, and if you do have questions, at least you can find out the representatives that you need to talk to there. But when we're talking about why it's fair for paying one speaker from a sum that was supposed to be for speakers and why we are laying off others, it's a difficult question that I think is beyond whether we should be inviting Condoleezza Rice, because we did not have the same speaking fee conversation about any of the other speakers. Another question was directly presented to me, and it was saying MSA said we were promoting an open dialogue. That resolution never said that MSA wanted to promote an open dialogue. If it had the language of promoting an open dialogue, yes, we would have asked for for more question and answer on top of the already existing questions that were asked by the people on stage. This was more so students had the opportunity to hear someone, a former Secretary of State, speak for free, and they suddenly learned that there was this outside organization that could somehow threaten that opportunity. No, my individual vote, I did not say, I did not think I was representing the entire campus as that. Me speaking up, the members of MSA speaking up, even if 100%, even if we don't have 100% voter turnout in our MSA elections, I think it is fairly well represented. And I do urge a representative from SDS to come to MSA, because we might not be talking about a Condoleezza Rice resolution every week, but we do talk about the budget and other issues that you do bring up, and I do expect that if you do stand for all these things like reducing tuition, challenging either administration or elite officials, I do expect that you come to what your peer students have set up as as organizations for voicing those concerns.
Thank you. I am still just moderating, but I would like to make a comment and something to think about. And the comment is, I just want to observe that whether it's here or at Rutgers or at Brandeis or any number of places for a long, long time, if you look where questions of free speech and controversy of this sort are arising, they're generally arising in cases where someone has been invited as someone else is now challenging after the fact whether or not that person should come. And the contrast to that is decision-making processes before the fact, in which people, and I think everyone, if you reflect on your experiences, will know this to be the case, in the decision-making process about whom to invite, it is routine for people to say, we should not invite that person, we should invite that person, to give all sorts of reasons and for inviting or not inviting people, and to not be seen as opposing free speech in doing that. So I'll raise several issues here about that, 3 to think about. One is that right? I mean, should that be the line? Is there something different going on after an invitation has been extended here at the university that we should adopt a different set of values and norms for the discussion about the rightness of them speaking, or how far, who should get what? The second question is, if in fact we believe that that's right, or in fact we just think that's the way it is, whether we like it or not, in either case, it suggests an especially strong need for scrutiny for the processes prior to the fact of who gets invited and under what conditions. And in that regard, I'll mention the person's question who asked, who knew about this? Who was involved in this process? And I can say, at least here at the Humphrey School, where I teach, that it was that the faculty and the staff and the students largely learned about this after the fact. And so therefore, we're in a position to confront these free speech issues in expressing any reservations. And I think that was true for the university as a whole for most of us. And then third of all, I'll just raise the issue of connecting this. If in fact those prior decisions are not just being made without a great deal of participation, but are actually being made by benefactors who get to use the money that they have to decide who will come, and then we have to react to that, I think we confront quite a serious set of issues in the privatization and commodification of the public university, in that we are endlessly in the position of only being able to express reservations, criticisms, objections against the shadow of trying to deprive someone of the ability to speak. And I'd like to thank the panel for all the comments and interesting things today that have been said, and I'd very much like to thank the audience for coming and for all the great comments you've contributed. Thank you very much.